They were not soldiers. Not in the usual sense. Anyway, they didn't charge through trenches or storm beaches under fire. Their weapons weren't rifles or grenades. They carried paintbrushes, radios, and speakers. And yet, they fought one of the strangest and most secret battles of World War II, a battle where illusion itself became the ultimate weapon. This is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, an American unit so secret that even the soldiers nearby had no idea who they really were. They weren't there to fight. They were there to pretend to fight. Their mission? To fool Hitler's army, to make the Nazis believe entire divisions of U.S. forces existed where there were none. And they did it using art, sound, and pure imagination, the birth of a strange idea. By 1944, the Allies had landed in Normandy and were pushing across France. But the Nazis were still fierce, unpredictable, and heavily armed. Commanders realized something vital. If they could confuse the Germans about where attacks were happening, they could save thousands of lives. The U.S. Army needed a deception unit. Not spies or saboteurs, but artists who could craft convincing illusions on a massive scale. And so, from art schools, design studios, and even fashion houses, they began recruiting the most unlikely soldiers in the war. Painters, sculptors, sound engineers, radio technicians, and set designers. Some had worked for Hollywood. Others had illustrated ads on Madison Avenue. Many came straight from art colleges like Yale and Pratt Institute. They called themselves the Ghosts. And officially, they were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, artists in uniform. Imagine this. You're a young art student, studying color theory and portrait lighting, and suddenly you're shipped off to the front lines of Europe. But your orders aren't to shoot. They're to create illusions big enough to trick the German army. That was reality for men like Bill Blass, who would later become one of America's most famous fashion designers, or Ellsworth Kelly, who became a renowned painter after the war. At that time, though, they were all soldiers with sketchbooks. Their leader was Colonel Harry L. Reeder, but the creative mind behind much of it was Ralph Ingersoll, a journalist and strategist who had one crazy belief, that if you could fake an army, you could change the course of a battle. The arsenal of illusion. The Ghost Army's toolkit looked nothing like normal military gear. Instead of tanks made of steel, they had inflatable rubber tanks, painted and sculpted to look real from the sky. Instead of heavy artillery, they had dummy cannons made of wood. Instead of roaring engines, they carried giant speakers that blasted recorded sounds of tanks and troop movements across the countryside. Up to 15 miles away, they could make it sound like an entire division, thousands of men, was camped out in a valley, when in reality, only a few hundred artists were there. Every operation combined 4 layers of deception. Visual deception, inflatable tanks, jeeps, fake camps, and phony tracks leading into forests. Sound deception, realistic battlefield audio projected from trucks, pre-recorded by sound engineers. Radio deception, fake signals, scripted communications mimicking actual U.S. divisions. Atmospheric deception, signs, uniforms, and even gossip planted to make locals believe a real army was nearby. Together, it was like staging a massive theater production, but one that could save lives instead of selling tickets. The first trick, Normandy. The Ghost Army's first major test came right after D-Day. The Allies needed to mislead German reconnaissance planes that were desperately scanning for the next invasion point. The 23rd Special Troops set up hundreds of inflatable vehicles, fake artillery lines, and bogus troop movements near Normandy. From above, it looked like an entire armored division preparing to strike. In truth, there were barely 1,000 men. The Germans fell for it. They redirected reinforcements, wasting critical time and resources, while real Allied divisions advanced elsewhere. It worked. And that's when the U.S. High Command realized something powerful. These artists weren't just entertainers. They were tactical magicians. Operation Brest. By August 1944, the Ghost Army took on their most dangerous mission yet, Operation Brest. The city of Brest, in western France, was heavily fortified. The Allies planned to surround it, but they needed the Germans to think the attack was coming from another direction. So, the 23rd went to work. In less than 48 hours, they created a fake army, hundreds of inflatable tanks lined up in open fields, truck convoys driving in loops to look endless, and speakers playing the thunder of rolling armor. From the sky, it looked completely real. German scouts reported back with full confidence. Enemy forces massing in the east. The deception worked so well that when the real Allied attack came from the west, it caught the Germans completely off guard. Thousands of lives were spared. The artists who risked everything. But here's the part that few people talk about. The Ghost Army's missions were incredibly dangerous. They operated close to enemy lines, sometimes within a few miles of real German troops. If they were caught, they had no heavy weapons to defend themselves, just pistols and courage. One member later said, "If we got captured, the Germans would probably just shoot us on the spot for pretending to be an army we weren't." They lived like actors, rehearsing roles that could get them killed. They wore the wrong patches, used fake unit names, even built false command tents where officers pretended to issue orders. They were not just soldiers. They were illusionists of war. Part 2. The sound of war. How they made fear from noise. War has a sound. It's not just explosions or gunfire. It's rhythm, chaos, and pressure. When you hear the rumble of tanks in the distance, you feel the ground tremble before you even see the threat. That's what the Ghost Army learned to weaponize. Because sometimes fear doesn't need bullets. It only needs noise. The sound wizards of the 23rd. In a dusty airfield in England, before being deployed to France, a small team of engineers began experimenting with something no army had ever tried, creating soundscapes of battle. Artificial wars made entirely of recorded audio. They were led by Corporal Harold Dahl, a sound engineer from the radio industry, and Lieutenant John Campbell, who'd once worked in Hollywood's sound department. Their job was to record the noises of tanks, jeeps, trucks, and artillery, then use them to build sonic illusions. They borrowed massive 500-pound wire recorders from Bell Labs, packed them with the rumble of M4 Shermans, the screech of brakes, the metallic clang of soldiers working on equipment. Every track was meticulously layered, looping, fading, echoing. They didn't just record sounds. They composed fear. When combined with inflatable tanks and fake radio chatter, the effect was devastatingly real. Operation Bedenburg, the Symphony of Deception. September 1944. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were ordered to Luxembourg, a quiet, forested region near the town of Bedenburg. Allied troops were thinly spread, and the Germans were preparing a counterattack. The Ghost Army's task: make the enemy believe an entire armored division was guarding the line. They arrived at night. No headlights, no noise. Within hours, they inflated hundreds of dummy tanks under camouflage nets. Then came the real show. Sound trucks, mounted with giant amplifiers, rolled into position along the tree line. They pointed their horns toward the German-held valley. Then, at midnight, the performance began. The rumble of engines, the metallic clank of treads, the chatter of soldiers, even the sound of hammers striking steel, all booming across the valley, echoing for miles. To the Germans listening in the dark, it sounded like an entire U.S. armored division was arriving. In reality, there were only a few dozen men, artists, painters, sound engineers, standing beside inflated rubber tanks. The Germans hesitated. They delayed their counterattack. And in those crucial hours, Allied reinforcements arrived. No shots were fired, but the Ghost Army won. The art of psychological warfare. What the Ghost Army understood, better than almost anyone, was human psychology. They knew soldiers don't always see their enemies clearly in battle. They rely on patterns. The sound of approaching vehicles, the movement of lights, the flow of radio messages. If you could mimic those patterns perfectly, you could make any army believe what you wanted. To them, war wasn't just about power, it was about perception. They studied how Germans reacted to specific sounds, how patrols interpreted distant movements. They even learned to imitate the exhaust rhythm of American trucks. So if a German scout was close enough to listen, it would sound genuine. This wasn't chaos. It was choreographed illusion, a deadly ballet of imagination, the masters of misdirection. Each operation required split-second timing and discipline. When the sound crews began broadcasting, radio operators were already playing their part. The Signal Company Special, the Ghost Army's radio division, sent fake transmissions that mimicked entire regiments. Operators used scripts based on real communication logs. They changed frequencies, call signs, and even the personal style of actual officers. They had to be flawless. German intelligence units were excellent at tracking Allied radio chatter. If even one message felt off, too robotic, too perfect, the deception could collapse. So, the Ghost Army practiced like actors. They performed radio conversations, complete with jokes, arguments, and background static, all to make the illusion more human. It worked so well that Nazi intelligence logs began reporting divisions that didn't exist. The ghosts had created phantoms on the battlefield, living the lie. Everywhere they went, the Ghost Army had to look real, sound real, and even act real. When stationed near civilians, soldiers would casually drop hints in cafes. "Oh, yeah, we're part of the 6th Armored, heading east tomorrow." Of course, there was no 6th Armored anywhere near them. But the locals would gossip, and soon the Germans would hear the same rumors, confirming what they were meant to believe. They even painted fake insignias on their vehicles and stitched false patches on their uniforms. Every detail mattered. One soldier recalled, "We had to be convincing enough that even our own army believed we were the real division." And sometimes they did. There were moments when real Allied troops wandered into Ghost Army zones, confused by the sea of fake tanks, asking for directions or reinforcements that didn't exist. That's how real the illusion became, the shadow within the war. But behind the success, there was something haunting about their work. They were artists, creators, now using their talents to wage psychological war. For some, it felt exhilarating. Their art was saving lives. For others, it felt eerie, even wrong, creating ghosts that could kill. They never saw their enemies' faces. They never pulled triggers. But they watched entire German divisions move away because of their tricks, and sometimes they knew what that meant. More Germans sent into hopeless battles elsewhere. More lives lost to an illusion. It was a strange kind of victory, the kind only artists could understand. Our greatest weapon was imagination. In letters home, some soldiers described their mission vaguely. "We're doing something unusual," one wrote, "something you probably won't believe." They couldn't tell anyone what they were doing. Their work was top secret, and it would remain classified for nearly 50 years. But within their own ranks, there was pride and awe. They were outsmarting the enemy not with bombs or bloodshed, but with brains and brushes. As one veteran later said, "Our greatest weapon wasn't firepower. It was imagination." Operation Viersen, the greatest illusion of the war. By early 1945, the war in Europe was reaching its final act. The Allies had pushed deep into German territory. Hitler's empire was collapsing, yet the fighting grew more desperate by the day. Bridges were blown, towns burned, and every river crossing became a bloodbath. And then came the Rhine, the final natural barrier before the Allied armies could march straight into the German heartland. But there was a problem. The Rhine was wide, heavily defended, and lined with German artillery. If the Allies attacked head-on, the cost would be catastrophic. So they turned once again to the masters of illusion, the Ghost Army. The mission at the Rhine, their task was bold, maybe even insane. They were to make the Germans believe that the U.S. Ninth Army, tens of thousands of troops, was preparing to cross the Rhine near Dusseldorf at a small town called Viersen. In reality, the real crossing would happen 10 miles north at Wesel. The Ghost Army would have to stage a fake invasion, a fake buildup, a fake war. They would become the decoy right in the enemy's sight line, setting the stage. On March 18, 1945, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops moved into the fields near Viersen under cover darkness. They worked like theater stagehands preparing for opening night. Hundreds of inflatable tanks were unloaded and inflated by hand pumps, filling with air until they took shape. M4 Shermans, M3 half-tracks, even armored cars. Each was placed carefully to look like an organized formation. The engineers laid down fake tire tracks, dragging trucks across the mud to make it look like heavy traffic had passed through. They pitched hundreds of tents, complete with laundry hanging outside, the kind of human detail that reconnaissance planes would notice. And to complete the illusion, they built phony artillery positions and even fake bridges leading toward the river. By dawn, it looked like a massive American division had arrived overnight, the orchestra of noise. But visuals were only part of the show. The sound crews got to work next. Using powerful amplifiers hidden in trucks, they blasted hours of recorded tank noises. Engines revving, metal clanking, soldiers shouting. It was all timed perfectly, echoing through the morning fog. To any German scout or spy listening from across the river, it was unmistakable. The Americans were massing for a crossing at Viersen. Radio operators added their own performance, transmitting fake messages between units, pretending to coordinate pontoon bridges and artillery cover. They even created phony radio mistakes, moments of confusion and chatter that made it sound authentic. It was a soundscape of chaos and confidence, a war that didn't exist. The spy in the sky. The next morning, German reconnaissance planes appeared above the horizon. They circled slowly, taking photographs of the division below. From 5,000 feet up, the inflatables looked real. Even the fake shadows painted beneath them sold the illusion. One Ghost Army soldier, Sergeant Arthur Shilstone, later said, "We watched that plane circle for 20 minutes. We were holding our breath the whole time, because if we realized those tanks were rubber, we were finished." But the plane didn't see through it. The photos went back to German command, and within 24 hours, enemy divisions began shifting south toward Viersen to prepare for the attack. That was exactly what the Allies wanted. The real attack. While the Germans fortified Viersen, the real U.S. Ninth Army crossed the Rhine at Wesel unopposed. Thousands of troops, tanks, and vehicles rolled across under cover of darkness. By the time the Germans realized what had happened, it was too late. The Allies had already secured the far bank. The deception at Viersen was so convincing that captured German officers later admitted they had completely believed the illusion. They had seen the fake tanks, heard the fake engines, intercepted fake radio chatter, and were certain that was where the main assault would happen. One officer reportedly said, "We thought you had an entire armor corps down there." In truth, it was just 1,100 men and a lot of air-filled rubber. The risk behind the curtain. Operation Viersen wasn't just a masterpiece of deception. It was an act of courage. The Ghost Army was operating barely 5 miles from enemy lines. They had no heavy weapons, no artillery, and no real armor to protect them. If the Germans had decided to attack, they would have been wiped out in minutes. Every man in the 23rd knew this. And yet, they stayed, keeping up the illusion night after night. They rotated dummy convoys, staged mock firefights, and even set up fake command posts with actors playing generals. Their goal wasn't just to fool German intelligence. It was to fool anyone watching with binoculars from across the river. One veteran later said, "It was like living inside a movie set, except the bullets were real." The curtain falls. After 10 days of deception, the mission was complete. The real Allied armies had crossed safely. The Ghost Army deflated their tanks, packed up their sound equipment, and vanished into the night, leaving behind empty fields and rubber carcasses that looked almost absurd in the daylight. But those absurd illusions had just saved thousands of lives. Operation Fearsome became the crown jewel of the Ghost Army's missions, a triumph of creativity over destruction. In total, their deception had diverted 2 entire German divisions, buying the Allies precious time and positioning for the final push toward Berlin. The war was ending, but their story wasn't over. In April 1945, as the Allies advanced through Germany, the Ghost Army continued smaller missions, faking troop movements, diverting artillery, and protecting real divisions. But they knew the end was near. They had done their job, and they had done it so well, even their fellow soldiers never knew the truth. The unit disbanded quietly that summer. Its members went home, carrying a secret that would remain classified for decades. They had fought in silence. They had created ghosts, and then disappeared like them. They called themselves the Ghosts. But behind every trick, every inflatable tank, and every phantom army were real people, young, talented men whose dreams had once been about color, form, and light, not camouflage and deception. They didn't start out wanting to fight a war. They wanted to create. But somehow, in one of history's strangest twists, their creativity became a weapon that helped defeat one of the darkest forces the world had ever known. From studio to battlefield. In 1942, as America ramped up for war, art schools across the country emptied overnight. Students and teachers traded brushes for helmets, sketchbooks for field manuals. Among them were Ellsworth Kelly, Bill Blass, Art Kane, and Arthur Singer, names that, after the war, would belong to some of the most celebrated artists and designers in America. But back then, they were just kids with a calling to serve. And the Army, in its odd way, found the perfect use for them. It began when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers started looking for people with creative technical skills. They didn't just want draftsmen. They wanted thinkers, people who could visualize how to manipulate space, light, and perception. And so, from art schools, advertising firms, and Hollywood studios, they built a unit of creative misfits. Men who could paint a tank to look like a truck, or make a meadow look like a fortress. The painter who saw war as a canvas. Ellsworth Kelly was 21 years old when he joined the 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion, the visual deception branch of the Ghost Army. He'd been studying art in Boston, fascinated by color and geometry. In France, that fascination took a darker turn. He found himself painting camouflage patterns, designing illusions, and sketching the French countryside not for beauty, but to learn how to hide tanks in it. Later, when he became one of America's most famous abstract artists, Kelly would say the war changed how he saw everything. It taught me that perception, what you think you're seeing, is as powerful as what's actually there. That idea, perception over reality, was the very heart of the Ghost Army. Bill Blass, the designer of deception. Then there was Bill Blass. Before he became a world-renowned fashion designer, he was just another 20-year-old from Indiana with a sketch pad and a sense of style. He joined the Ghost Army in 1943 and found himself designing camouflage nets, drawing insignias for fake divisions, and even sketching out how to make inflatable tanks look like they just rolled through mud. Decades later, when he was dressing presidents and celebrities, Blass rarely talked about the war. But in one interview, he said something telling. "It was the first time I learned that design could save lives. We weren't dressing people. We were dressing an illusion. The sound sculptors and radio artists. Not all the ghosts painted or built props. Some sculpted in sound. Men like Harold Dahl, George Reeder, and John Campbell, sound engineers and musicians before the war, created elaborate oral landscapes that fooled the German army again and again. They'd sit inside trucks, wearing headphones, replaying the roars of engines, the grind of treads, and the thump of distant artillery. Every frequency was calculated. Every echo placed for maximum realism. Their recordings came from real battlefields. Some captured by Bell Labs technicians at Fort Knox, others recorded during live tank drills in England. It was the first time in history that audio engineering became a weapon of war. The radio operators were just as creative. Using portable transmitters, they became actors, pretending to be entire battalions. They even mimicked the personal quirks of specific commanders' voices. When Nazi intelligence intercepted their messages, it never crossed their minds that the voices were fake. They were listening to performances, carefully written scripts designed to mislead, the sketchbooks of war. For many of these young artists, the war was also a surreal sketchbook. Between operations, they drew everything, The villages they passed through, the soldiers they met, even the fake tanks they built. Their sketchbooks became records of contradiction, beauty and war, art and destruction, laughter in the middle of chaos. Private Arthur Singer, who would later become one of America's greatest wildlife illustrators, sketched birds in war zones. He wrote in his journal, "Even in the middle of deception, I felt compelled to paint something true." His art, and that of his comrades, would one day tell the hidden story of the Ghost Army long before the government ever did. Living with secrets. The Ghost Army was sworn to secrecy. No one, not even their families, could know what they were doing. They couldn't explain why their unit moved constantly, why they carried strange equipment, or why their missions didn't appear in official reports. For years after the war, when veterans spoke of their service, they simply said, "We were with a special unit," and left it at that. The truth wouldn't emerge until the 1990s, when the U.S. Army finally declassified the Ghost Army's missions. By then, many of its members were gone. Those who remained were stunned to see the public finally learning what they'd done. It wasn't glory they wanted, just recognition that art, in its strangest form, had helped win a war. Art after the war. When the guns went silent in 1945, the Ghosts returned home, to studios, classrooms, and galleries. Many went on to redefine American art and design in the post-war world. Ellsworth Kelly became a pioneer of abstract minimalism. Arthur Singer painted the birds that would appear in U.S. postage stamps for decades. Bill Blass redefined fashion on New York's runways. Their art, in some way, carried traces of their wartime work, an understanding of perception, space, and illusion. One art critic once said, "If you look closely at post-war American art, you can still see the Ghost Army's fingerprints, the geometry, the deception, the control of what's seen and unseen, the human cost." Yet behind the creativity was a quiet trauma. The Ghosts saw the aftermath of real battles, towns destroyed, civilians lost, soldiers buried under rubble. They didn't fight those battles, but they walked through their shadows. Some never spoke about what they'd witnessed. Others poured it into their work, abstract shapes, haunting colors, or quiet beauty that felt like recovery. They had fought not with violence, but with imagination. And imagination leaves its scars too. Part 5. The Hidden Legacy, How the Ghost Army Changed Modern Warfare. When the war ended in 1945, the Ghost Army vanished like smoke. Their tanks deflated, their sounds fell silent, their radios went dark. The men packed their brushes, rolled up their sketches, and went home, quietly, without medals, without parades. The world never knew their story. At least, not yet. But the echoes of their work didn't disappear. In secret rooms and strategy papers, military thinkers across the world began to realize something extraordinary. These artists had reinvented the meaning of warfare, and they had done it with art, sound, and psychology, the birth of modern deception. Before the Ghost Army, deception in war was crude. Fake tanks made of wood, camouflage netting, a few decoy maneuvers. But what the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops did was different. They brought integration, the blending of visuals, sound, radio, and theater, to craft complete illusions. This concept became the blueprint for what modern militaries now call tactical deception operations. Their four-layer system, visual, sonic, radio, and atmospheric deception, is still studied today by intelligence units around the world. It was the first time art and science had merged to manipulate the human mind on a battlefield. One post-war analyst wrote, "The Ghost Army didn't just fool the Germans. They fooled the very concept of warfare." Lessons that echoed into the Cold War. When the Iron Curtain descended and the Cold War began, the U.S. military quietly revisited what the Ghost Army had accomplished. In a world of spies, misinformation, and nuclear standoffs, deception became just as valuable as firepower. Psychological operations, PSYOPs as they're known, took root. Leaflets, propaganda, false broadcasts, and even entire fake bases were created to manipulate perception. Many of those methods drew direct inspiration from the Ghost Army's tactics in France and Germany. In Vietnam, U.S. troops used sound deception to simulate troop movements in jungles. During the Gulf War, inflatable tanks and aircraft, eerily similar to those from 1944, were deployed in the desert to mislead enemy radar. And in modern conflicts, cyber units now use digital illusions, fake data, electronic signatures, and decoy signals, all carrying the same DNA that began with a few painters and sound engineers 80 years ago. The tools changed, but the idea stayed the same. Make the enemy see what isn't there. Forgotten for 50 years. For decades, the Ghost Army remained buried under secrecy. Their missions were classified until 1996, 51 years after the war. By then, most of the veterans were old men, many already gone. When the documents were finally declassified, historians couldn't believe what they were reading. A small group of artists, designers, and technicians had conducted over 20 deception operations across Europe, directly affecting the outcome of several key battles. They had drawn enemy fire away from Allied divisions, protected crossings, and saved countless lives. And yet, not one of them had been publicly recognized. Their families were stunned. For years, sons and daughters had believed their fathers were just radio clerks or map makers. Now they were learning that those same men had staged fake invasions and bluffed entire armies. One veteran's daughter said, "It was like finding out your dad had been a magician who saved the world." Rediscovery and honor. It took years of work from historians and surviving members to bring the Ghost Army story to light. Veterans like Bernie Bluestein, Seymour Nussenbaum, and John Jarvie began giving interviews, sharing old photographs, sketches, and stories. Their testimonies revealed a world of creativity, courage, and secrecy. Filmmakers and researchers pieced together their legacy. The deflated tanks and dusty photos, the recorded tapes of fake engines, the art journals filled with coded sketches. And finally, in 2022, nearly 80 years after their deception began, the United States Congress passed the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal Act. It was one of the highest civilian honors in the nation, awarded to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and their sister unit, the 3133rd Signal Company Special, for their unique and highly distinguished service. The medal was officially signed into law in February 2022. It was a moment of long overdue recognition. One of the last surviving ghosts, Bernie Bluestein, 98 years old, said, "We didn't do it for medals. We did it to save lives." But it's nice to know that after all these years, someone finally noticed the ghosts. Legacy in art and imagination. What makes their story so haunting isn't just what they did, but who they were. They were artists, dreamers who turned illusion into survival. Their legacy didn't just live in military textbooks. It lived in museums, galleries, and classrooms. If you walk into Smithsonian today, you'll find their sketches, drawings of fake tanks, maps of deception zones, and painted backdrops for phantom armies. Each one is a strange fusion of war and art, beauty in service of chaos, order in service of confusion. And yet, those sketches hold something deeper. They remind us that creativity isn't just decoration. It can be strategy. It can be defense. It can be a weapon, when wielded by those who understand the power of imagination. How the ghosts change the meaning of victory. The Ghost Army story forces us to ask a difficult question. What does it mean to win a war? They never fired a shot in anger. They never stormed a hill or captured a city. But by using deception, they prevented thousands of deaths, Allied and German alike. Their victory wasn't measured in ground gained, but in lives spared. In a war defined by destruction, they proved that creation, even fake creation, could be just as powerful. It's ironic, almost poetic. The same tools that build illusions in art galleries were used to build illusions on battlefields. And somehow, that saved real human lives. That's why, decades later, military historians often refer to them as the artists who won without fighting, from shadows to memory. Today, when new generations of soldiers train in deception tactics, they often hear whispers of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Their methods are still taught, not as relics, but as foundations. And yet, beyond the strategies and technology, there's a deeper lesson the Ghost Army left behind, that the human mind, its creativity, adaptability, and wit, remains the greatest battlefield of all. For in the end, their most powerful weapon wasn't sound or paint or camouflage. It was belief. They made their enemies believe in ghosts. And that belief reshaped the war. Part 6. The Secrets Within Silence, Living as Invisible Heroes. The war ended. The guns fell silent. But for the men of the Ghost Army, silence didn't mean peace. It meant secrecy. They had signed oaths binding them to silence under the threat of military prosecution. They couldn't tell their wives what they'd done. They couldn't tell their children why they had nightmares about radios and rubber tanks. To the world, they were just another group of returning soldiers. Only they knew the truth, that they'd fought a war built on lies. Life after the illusion. When the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops disbanded in September 1945, its members scattered back into civilian life. Many returned to their old passions. Ellsworth Kelly became one of the 20th century's greatest abstract artists. Bill Blass became a world-famous fashion designer in New York, dressing presidents and movie stars. Arthur Singer turned his love of nature into iconic wildlife paintings for postage stamps. They carried brushes instead of guns again, but something inside them had changed. Each stroke, each sketch, each color, all now carried a shadow of the deception they had once created to save lives. They had seen the power of illusion up close. They had watched it manipulate human behavior, bend reality, and shift the course of battle. And that knowledge, that arc of controlled perception, stayed with them forever. The weight of secrets. Some veterans admitted that the hardest part wasn't what they saw. It was what they couldn't say. When asked what he did in the war, one veteran said, "I told people I was in camouflage." That usually ended the conversation. Another laughed bitterly. "Try explaining to your kids that you fought Nazis with rubber tanks." They wanted to share their stories, the creativity, the teamwork, the absurd comedy of it all, but they couldn't. The files were classified. Their photos locked in government archives. Their operations erased from official war records. To everyone else, they were ghosts twice over, unseen on the battlefield and forgotten in history. Many of them felt pride mixed with guilt. They knew their work saved thousands of lives, but they also knew that real soldiers had died in the very deceptions they created. When the enemy attacked their decoy positions, sometimes shells landed near the real troops. The line between illusion and sacrifice was always razor thin. One ghost veteran later confessed, "We built a circus of sound and shadow, and sometimes people died believe it was real. That's something you never forget." The quiet bonds. Even though they couldn't speak publicly, the Ghost Army veterans quietly found each other in the years after the war. They met at small reunions, art galleries, and veterans' halls, sharing sketches, laughing about inflatable tanks, remembering the chaos and the brilliance of their missions. Those gatherings were sacred, a place where they could finally talk freely, among those who understood the strange duality of what they'd done. They'd reminisce about the absurd moments, painting fake mud on fake trucks, adjusting the sound of tank engines so they matched the right vehicle model, and arguing over how many imaginary divisions they were pretending to be that week. It was part theater, part engineering, part madness, and all of it held together by courage. One of them once joked, "We weren't soldiers pretending to be artists. We were artists pretending to be soldiers, pretending to be a whole army." And everyone in the room laughed, because it was true, the pain behind the genius. But beneath the laughter, there was pain too. The Ghost Army's missions were physically and emotionally dangerous. They often operated within artillery range of the Germans. Some members were killed during decoy operations, died without anyone knowing what mission they had truly been on. Imagine standing in an open field, inflating a fake tank, while hearing real shells explode around you, knowing that if the deception failed, you'd be facing a German division with nothing but canvas and paint. That was their daily reality. And when they returned home, there were no medals waiting, no stories told in newspapers, no thanks. For many, it felt as though the war they fought had been erased from history, because it was made of lies, the art of memory. In the decade that followed, the Ghost Army story began surfacing quietly through art. A few veterans, now older and freer, started creating works inspired by their secret missions. Some painted surreal landscapes filled with hollow shapes and shadows, metaphors for illusion. Others sculpted abstract figures, symbolizing the weight of deception and truth. It wasn't confession. It was release. Through art, they finally began to process what they had done and what it had cost them. At a small exhibition in the late 1980s, a journalist asked one Ghost Army veteran what the experience had taught him. He smiled and said, "That truth is fragile, and sometimes the only way to protect it is with a lie." Echoes and silence. When the Ghost Army's documents were finally declassified in the 1990s, some of the veterans were still alive to see it. They sat in living rooms with their grandchildren, holding newspaper clippings that finally revealed their secret. For many, it was overwhelming to have their invisible war finally acknowledged, to see the sketches and photos they'd hidden for half a century suddenly displayed in museums and books. Some wept. Others simply said, "It's about time." But all of them felt the same quiet relief. The silence was finally over. The power of the hidden story. The Ghost Army story isn't just a tale of wartime deception. It's about the power of creativity and the burden of genius. These were men who blurred the lines between illusion and survival, truth and art, fear and laughter. They showed the world that intelligence and imagination can win battles that brute force never could. And even though they lived half their lives as ghosts, their story proves that truth, no matter how long it's buried, always finds a way to rise. End of Part 6. Approximate 1,060 words. Would you like me to continue with Part 7? The Final Illusion, How History Remembered the Ghosts, which concludes a full 7,500-word story with the emotional wrap-up and final reflection on how their legacy lives in modern culture and technology. Part 7. The Final Illusion, How History Remembered the Ghosts. When the war was over and the secrets began to fade, the world moved on. But somewhere between truth and imagination, the story of the Ghost Army lingered, waiting to be remembered. It began as whispers in military circles, a legend about an army that never was. But over time, those whispers became voices of historians, artists, and soldiers, all asking the same question. How could a group of artists have changed the outcome of World War II? Reconstructing the ghosts. In the early 2000s, filmmakers and researchers began piecing together the fragments of this incredible story. Old photographs surfaced, black and white images of soldiers smiling beside inflated Sherman tanks. Audio reels were uncovered with looping engine sounds, recorded on heavy magnetic tape. And from dusty storage boxes came sketches, exquisite, detailed, hauntingly beautiful. Maps, diagrams, and watercolor scenes of deception. Each artifact was a piece of a puzzle that, when assembled, revealed something extraordinary. That illusion had once been a weapon of victory. The men behind those illusions were now in their 80s and 90s, their memories fragile but sharp. They told stories with a glint in their eyes, of nights filled with danger, laughter, and art supplies. They spoke of the adrenaline of performing their deception under fire, of the absurdity of pretending to be generals, tank commanders, and mechanics, all at once, and of the pride they felt in knowing that their creativity had saved countless lives. One of them said softly, "We didn't carry guns. We carried imagination." And it worked. From forgotten to immortalized, the rediscovery of the Ghost Army story set off a wave of documentaries, books, and exhibitions. The Smithsonian Institution displayed their artifacts. The National World War II Museum curated immersive exhibits where visitors could see the inflatable tanks, hear the sonic tracks, and even listen to intercepted German radio reports baffled by phantom divisions. Hollywood took notice too. Producers began developing scripts, some dramatic, some humorous, about the strange, beautiful absurdity of an army of artists fighting a war with paint, sound, and deception. It was as if the Ghost Army had staged one final illusion. After disappearing for half a century, they suddenly appeared everywhere. And this time, they weren't ghosts. They were legends. The medal they never asked for. In 2022, after years of lobbying by historians and families, the Ghost Army finally received the Congressional Gold Medal, one of America's highest honors. At the ceremony, held in Washington, D.C., only a handful of surviving veterans remained. Their backs were bent, their hands trembling, but their eyes shone with the same mischievous spark they'd had in 1944. As the medal was unveiled, gleaming gold, embossed with the words, "Deception saved lives," the room fell silent. One veteran, barely able to speak, whispered, "We never thought anyone would remember, but I guess even ghosts can be seen if you wait long enough." It was a moment not just of recognition, but of resurrection. A story that had lived in the shadows finally stepped into the light. How they changed the world. The legacy of the Ghost Army reaches far beyond the battlefields of Europe. Their experiments with illusion and perception laid the groundwork for modern psychological warfare, information operations, and military camouflage design. In today's digital age, where disinformation, holographic decoys, and AI-generated simulations shape the battlefield of minds, their ideas are more relevant than ever. Every cyber deception, every false signal, every digital decoy traces its lineage back to those artists with rubber tanks and paintbrushes. They showed that war isn't always fought with bullets. Sometimes it's fought with belief, the human side of illusion. Yet, for all their brilliance, what makes the Ghost Army story timeless isn't just a strategy. It's the humanity behind it. They were men barely out of college, thrust into a world at war. They used humor to cope, art to survive, and creativity to protect others. They didn't seek glory or fame, only to return home and live their lives. And maybe that's what makes them heroes, in the purest sense. They turned deception, a word often linked with dishonor, into an act of mercy. Their lies saved lives. Their illusions ended suffering. Their art stopped bullets before they were ever fired. In the end, they proved something extraordinary. That imagination, when used with courage, can be more powerful than destruction. The ghosts in the museum. If you visit the Ghost Army exhibit today, you'll see rows of inflatable tanks under dim museum lights. They look harmless, almost comical, like props from forgotten circus. But when you stand there in the silence, surrounded by those hollow shapes, you can almost hear the echo of distant engines, the crackle of fake radio chatter, the laughter of young men creating illusions that changed history. Somewhere among those echoes are the voices of the artists who once stood there, paintbrush in hand, pretending to command invisible armies. And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand what they truly achieved. Not just victory over Hitler, but victory over fear, over the idea that creativity has no place in war, over the belief that art is powerless in the face of violence, because they prove the opposite. A final reflection. The Ghost Army reminds us that history isn't just about power, it's about imagination. They turn canvas into courage, sound into strategy, and lies into the most human kind of truth. The will to save life overtake it. In a world obsessed with strength, they chose cleverness. In a war built on destruction, they built illusions. And through that paradox, they showed the world that the sharpest weapon of all is the human mind. As one of them wrote in his sketchbook before leaving Europe in 1945, "We leave behind ghosts, not the dead, but of the living ideas that fooled death itself." And perhaps that's the most haunting truth of all, that the ghosts of the Ghost Army were never meant to disappear. They were meant to remind us that imagination can change the world.